A famous saying from a military history program on television has gone viral on the web. To cherish peace, we look back on war. With this classic quote, the sensitive topic of war is transformed into a thought-provoking maxim that enlightens our lives. Its ingenious twist is truly remarkable. Now, speaking of revisiting World War II, in a peaceful context, if the Spanish Civil War was the most intriguing prelude, then the Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland stands out as the most vivid illustration. Without the Winter War, there might not have been Nazi Germany's audacious Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union at least. It would have been significantly delayed. Why? Because it was during the Winter War that the Soviet Union suffered tactical defeats but strategic victories. These events emboldened the fascist leader, Adolf Hitler, to declare, "The Soviet Union is like a crumbling house. One kick and it will collapse." The Nazis' audacity wasn't entirely unfounded. Had they not diverted troops to the Balkan Peninsula to assist their unreliable ally Italy, wasting precious time, the invasion of the Soviet Union might have occurred before the harsh winter set in, potentially allowing them to capture Moscow. The Winter War, which began on November 30, 1939, when the Soviet Union launched an offensive against Finland, lasted until March 30, 1940, when both sides signed the Moscow Peace Treaty. It endured an entire winter, earning its fitting nickname the Winter War. Here are approximate casualty statistics for both sides. Soviet Union personnel casualties 370,000, nearly 4 times that of the Finnish forces. International image, won militarily but lost politically. Finland personnel casualties 100,000. Territorial concessions are forced to cede and lease parts of its territory to the Soviet Union. Interestingly, the Winter War shares similarities with the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian War. Both wars aimed to establish large buffer zones along their borders. Despite being labeled as localized conflicts, they involved substantial military forces. Regardless of how the Winter War played out, tiny Finland, with its sparse population, had no chance of victory. To avoid war, Finland couldn't align with anti-Soviet camps. It had to remain strictly neutral, even leaning toward pro-Soviet sentiments. This principle applies to both historical Finland and present-day Ukraine. The difference lies in timing. Historical Finland faced a world already embroiled in World War II, where major powers struggled to protect themselves and couldn't offer assistance. Modern Ukraine benefits from a relatively peaceful world, relying on NATO, the world's most formidable military alliance. It was NATO's intervention that saved Ukraine's life. Otherwise, Ukraine will be like Finland, unable to survive even one winter. In the game between the Soviet Union and Finland, Finland's resistance stemmed from the hope that their influential allies would come to their aid. Finland's surrender resulted from the realization that their supposed allies wouldn't lift a finger. The Soviet Union's insistence on war rose from unwarranted self-confidence in its military might. The high Soviet casualties were partly due to their earlier self-inflicted wounds during the Great Purge. The Finnish nation has faced a tumultuous destiny. Ruled by the Swedish kingdom in the late 12th century, Finland was later occupied by the Russian Empire. In the 1809 Russo-Swedish War, after the Swedish defeat, Finland became a Grand Duchy under the Russian Tsar. In 1905, Finland launched its first nationwide general strike, forcing Imperial Russia to restore Finnish autonomy. On December 6, 1917, Finland declared complete independence. During Stalin's era, fearing a Nazi German attack on the Soviet Union, Finland's border with Leningrad St. Petersburg was a mere 32 kilometers away. Concerned that Finland might lean toward Nazi Germany and become a bridgehead for attacking the Soviet Union, Both countries signed a non-aggression pact in 1932. In the fall of 1939, the Soviet Union demanded that Finland retreat 25 kilometers from the Karelian Isthmus border area toward Leningrad, and lease the Hanko Peninsula for 30 years to build a Soviet naval base. The Soviet offer was to cede twice the territory's area in return. However, the ceded land was near the Arctic Circle, frozen, sparsely populated, economically backward, and worthless. It is obvious that the Soviet Union was bullying its weak neighbors and went too far, because the Soviet Union had annexed the 3 Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Finland was very worried that Stalin had the opportunity to annex Finland. On November 3, 1939, the Finnish government notified the Soviet Union that it did not agree to foreign troops stationed on Finnish territory or the establishment of naval bases. Seeing that the negotiations failed, the Soviet Union became angry and created the Manila shelling incident. It claimed that the Finnish army shelled the village of Manila, causing the death and injury of several Soviet soldiers. It then demanded an apology from the Finnish government, and the troops retreated 20 to 25 kilometers. This unreasonable request was flatly rejected by the Finnish government. The Soviet Union used this as an excuse to abrogate the Soviet-Finnish non-aggression treaty and actively prepare for war. On December 1, 1939, the Soviet Union supported a Finnish traitor, established a puppet regime, and incited pro-socialist elements in the Finnish army to rebel. Also, the Soviet Union drew up an operational plan against Finland. The Soviet army first assembled 300,000 troops on the border. The commander of the Leningrad military district, Morozkov, served as the frontline commander. Later, the number of troops was gradually increased to more than 400,000. The Soviet Union was extremely optimistic about the war. The Minister of Defense even told the artillery that they only needed to prepare 12 days of ammunition. They also specially organized a military band, which they planned to use at the entry ceremony into Helsinki, the capital of Finland, to show off their power. Even Stalin believed that the war would not last more than half a month. Finland, with a population of only 3 million, has very limited combat readiness. Its standing army is less than 30,000 people, and its equipment is far inferior to that of the Soviet army. It even still uses artillery made in the 19th century and has only 28 tanks. The only equipment more advanced are infantry light weapons, especially the Somi submachine gun, which has high accuracy and fast firing rate. When the Finnish guerrillas attacked the Soviet army, they were equipped with Somi submachine guns, and their firepower was not inferior at all. Although Finland's national strength is nothing compared to the size of the Soviet Union, thousands of Finnish soldiers still fulfilled their mission as soldiers and got into the forest and snowfields on the front line. Moreover, the vast majority of pro-socialists in Finland did not stand with the Soviet Union but instead fought side by side with their compatriots. On November 30, 1939, the Soviet army launched a full-scale attack on Finland with a huge force. The Soviet-Finnish War has officially begun. The Finnish army on the frontal battlefield launched a desperate counterattack by relying on favorable conditions such as the defense line, severe cold, swamps, and forests. Although the enemy was outnumbered and the war was dangerous, Finland still mobilized 400,000 people to participate in the war. The Finnish army's Mannerheim line of defense became an insurmountable barrier for the Soviet army. The Soviet 7th Army, which was responsible for the main attack, had no reliable ability to coordinate an attack and could only use human-sea tactics to kill people. When the infantry attacked, the tank was still far behind, looking sleepy. As a result, the infantry was littered with corpses under the Finnish army's strafing fire. When the Soviet tanks came up, the infantry withdrew again. Moreover, the level of shelling cannot be flattered. After a sudden and overwhelming artillery fire attack, all the permanent fortifications of the Finnish army stood tall and safe. The most ironic thing is that the Finnish army, on the opposite side, turned out to be a ragtag army, a civilian army formed spontaneously by a wealthy Finnish businessman. Although the Finnish army rarely has anti-tank guns, it can easily approach tanks, throw incendiary bottles, and plug tank tracks with wood. After only 4 days of fighting, the Soviet army lost 239 tanks on the battlefield behind enemy lines. In the Soviet-Finnish War, wealthy Finnish businessmen spent their wealth, spontaneously purchased weapons, and organized militiamen to participate in the war. Finnish lumberjacks, fishermen, and hunters relied on their familiarity with the terrain to shuttle between the Soviet armies, constantly harassing the Soviet army's fragile logistics supply lines with cold guns. They are densely packed in uninhabited forests and lakes, attacking exposed targets mysteriously. The Soviet army was completely plunged into the vast ocean of guerrilla warfare. The Finnish army's ski camp specializes in hunting supply convoys, field kitchens, and field hospitals. This logistical harassment tactic was a great success. The commander of the 44th Division of the Soviet Army was sentenced to death for retreating. One of the crimes was the loss of 55 field kitchens. The Finnish army became stronger and stronger as it fought, while the Soviet army became weaker and weaker as it fought. By this time, more than 10,000 Swiss, British, Danes, and Norwegians had come as volunteers to participate in the war against the Soviet Union. U.S. President Roosevelt delivered a speech condemning the Soviet Union. The British government was already preparing to send troops to Finland to assist in the war. The League of Nations simply kicked the Soviet Union out. Due to heavy losses, the Soviet army had to suspend troops on the battlefield in December and redraw the battle plan. As a result, the Soviet-Finnish War entered its second stage. On January 7, 1940, the Soviet army established the Northwest Front in the Karelian Isthmus and appointed the former commander of the Kiev military district, Timoshenko, commander of the front, and served as the frontline commander. A large number of troops were sent to the Soviet-Finnish border, reaching 900,000. On February 1, the Soviet army launched another massive attack. By March, Finland's defense lines were in critical condition across the board, and its troops were exhausted and began to retreat to the second line of defense. On March 5, the Finnish army was depleted and its food and ammunition were exhausted. With no hope of reinforcements, the Finnish government, under the control of Sweden, sent personnel to Moscow to sue for peace. On March 7. At that time, the Soviet Union was exhausted and was looking for a way out. First, international public opinion was becoming increasingly unfavorable to the Soviet Union. Second, spring was coming soon. Once the ice and snow melted, it would be difficult for the Soviet tank clusters to deploy, and they would inevitably return to the endless battle. A low level of attrition. As a result, the Soviet Union agreed to armistice negotiations. Finland accepted the Soviet Union's request on March 12, ending the 3.5-month war. Representatives of both parties signed a contract. Finland ceded to the Soviet Union a total of more than 40,000 square kilometers of land in the southeast, the entire Karelian Isthmus region including Vyborg, and most of the islands in the Gulf of Finland. And list the Hanko Peninsula. Give the Soviet Union 30 years, and the Soviet Union will pay Finland an annual rent of 8 million Finnish marks. Later, Finland became friendly with Germany and allowed Germany to station troops in Finland, but did not join the Axis group. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union, Finland took advantage of the situation and counterattacked the Soviet Union, but it was limited to recovering the land lost in the Winter War and did not set foot in the hinterland of the Soviet Union. Later in the war, the Soviet army counterattacked again and regained the land it had occupied in the Winter War. Finland had no choice but to negotiate peace with the Soviet Union again, and then drove away the German troops from the territory by force. After the war, Finland and the Soviet Union re-signed a cession treaty and restored peace. In recent years, after the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian War, Finland once again wavered in its neutrality, which seemed a bit too much, because many large-scale wars in history were caused by blind arching fire and arbitrary misjudgments. Among them, the Soviet-Finnish War and the Russo-Ukrainian War are typical examples. The Soviet-Finnish War and the Russo-Ukrainian War are so strikingly similar. Is it a passage of time and space or a reincarnation of history? Regarding this torture of the soul, a humble gentleman and a blind and angry young man must have different interpretations. But if you have the responsibility to take responsibility for history, I am afraid there could be only one answer.